We now devote ourselves to the hearing of the Spirit of God through the Word of God because we are the people of God. The people of God, called out from the world, chosen by the Father, redeemed by the Son, being transformed by the Spirit, and journeying together to that great day when the reign of Christ will fill the earth. Well, it was just 12 days ago that we turned our calendars to a new year, 2025. And the celebrations, of course, went on around the world. Some of you may have turned your television on and watched the infamous ball drop from Times Square. Others perhaps had a chance to glimpse at the pyrotechnics of that were shot off from Dallas and the Reunion Tower, and trying to set a whole new standard for how many fireworks and lights can hit the sky. And of course, with all these amazing celebrations, we had this rather endless list of predictions and prognostications. What's going to happen in 2025? Some of them are just entertaining. Some of them are sobering, right? I mean, you could probably find people who will say the stock market is going to go up in 2025. And you'll find many others who say, no, the stock market's going to go down in 2025. You'll find some predictions that say 2025 will be a great year to buy a house. Now, 2025 is going to be a terrible year to buy a house. Some will suggest that the war in Ukraine will end. Other predictions are that China is going to increase pressure on the West. Some will suggest that the Middle East is going to explode into World War III. Predictions, prognostications. Some are going to suggest that the democracies are going to crumble under left-wing ideologies or right-wing activism. Some will suggest that the Cowboys will win the Super Bowl. All right, so some predictions are really hard to believe. Why are we so interested in all these predictions? It's because we all know that we are going to have to make decisions really every day about how we live our lives. And if we know what's going to happen, it impacts how we make decisions. Sometimes small, sometimes large, but these decisions are going to be based on what we know or expect about the future. Most of those predictions, as you might guess, probably are not all that reliable. They're more like guesses. But there's one prediction that I would suggest to you is extremely reliable about 2025. One prediction from the Bible that we can count on. It's the kind of prediction that we know is true and will happen, and therefore it will affect our decision making. And the issue is not stock market or economy or war. The issue is this: what will happen with the mission of God? What will happen with what God is doing on the earth? What can we expect from God's plan in the year ahead? Now, such a subject might surprise you because you probably didn't jump on your list of favorite predictions and hear that one talked about. For a lot of us, it just gets dismissed. Well, that's something that once in a while we might talk about in church, but that's really not important for my life. But I'd suggest to you that really that subject, what will happen with the mission of God, is the most important subject for our year to come in 2025. The good news here is that the Bible actually answers that question for us in probably three nice, clear statements. And I will tell you that there's good news, there's bad news, and there's better news. So we want to explore those three types of news this morning and find out what is good that God is doing with his mission, what is bad or difficult to grasp about the mission of God, and then what is even better. And I think what you'll find is that it all leads to great encouragement for us. The story we're going to look at, as I already told you, is going to be from the book of Exodus, and it's written to a people who are about to enter the promised land. It's written to a generation of people who are going to be losing their leader, Moses, but they're going to be launching out on a new adventure in the year in front of them, and it will be difficult. I believe that this story has been written for us, even this whole book has been written for them, so that they will know what God's mission will be like as they move forward into uncertainty. So we start with the good news. Good news for Israel, good news for us. And the news is this: when the mission of God seems invisible, it's actually marching forward. When the mission of God seems to be stuck, going nowhere, imperceptible, it really is going forward. And we're challenged to see it. We're in Exodus chapter 1, and in the first 7 verses here, we get a glimpse into a time in Israel's life when, well, honestly, it seemed that the mission of God was going nowhere slowly. But, in fact, the mission of God for Israel, though seeming invisible, it was marching forward. We begin with verses 1 through 6. Exodus chapter 1, verse 1. These are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his family. There was Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all. Joseph, he was already in Egypt. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died. We'll stop there. It looks like there is nothing happening with the mission of God. It's no longer visible. Now, this is not a story that kind of begins like many stories. Once upon a time, there was this guy named Jacob. No. The author has written this in such a way that he's kind of starting more like, do you remember when? Because he's looking back to a time in Israel's history when God said, there was a day, you remember, when the sons of Israel, the man formerly known as Jacob, those sons left the land where they were, and they moved to Egypt because there was a famine in that land. And when they came, they were held in high esteem because Joseph, who was already in Egypt, he had a very special relationship with the Pharaoh. In fact, he'd been exalted to the second highest position in the land, and he helped preserve Israel and Egypt from terrible years of famine. Those were pretty good years for that little group of 70. And they came, and they had a great relationship with Egypt. Even got their own little corner of the Egyptian real estate. And then they died. What had happened? I mean, there had been a promise that God had given to Abraham, a promise that God was going to work his mission through him, that through Abraham, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. Through Abraham, there would be, his descendants would be great and numerous. They'd be a great nation. Abraham came to the end of his life, and that promise was not fulfilled. So he handed off the promise to his son, Isaac. And Isaac walked in the faith of his father Abraham, but when he came to the end of his life, there was no fulfillment. So he handed off the promise to his son, Jacob. And Jacob, he struggled a bit with his faith. And yet God brought into him and his family 12 sons. Jacob had fled from the land, and he was with Laban, and yet God, in his grace and mercy, gave birth to 12 sons who would become the 12 tribes of Israel. And then Jacob, near his death, handed off that promise to Joseph, and they ended up in Egypt. So for these original readers, when they hear these names that you and I go, Asher? Who would name their boy Asher? Gad? Naphtali? What kind? Those names don't mean much to us. But for the Israelite reader, they're going, oh, we remember those guys. They're the names of the heads of the tribes of Israel. And by stating their names, the author is saying, look, the promise that was given to Abraham and handed down to Isaac and to Jacob has now come to Egypt. Wonderful. The mission of God was moving forward, but they died. Mission ended, right? Not so fast. Because verse 7 will say that though that generation died, a lot more were born. Verse 7 says, but the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly. They increased in numbers, and they became so numerous that the land was filled with them. In other words, though the mission of God looked invisible, it was actually moving forward in the most significant manner. How do we know that? Well, we know that because of the way that the author has written this statement, that what is happening to the Israelites, did you see it? They were fruitful, they multiplied, they filled the earth. Have we heard that language before? Yeah, that's Genesis chapter 1. When God had said that as he created all mankind, that for his people he would say, go and fill the earth and subdue it, to multiply, to be his image bearers and fill the earth with his image. That language gets repeated one more time when Noah comes out of the ark in Genesis chapter 9, same words. And now in Exodus chapter 1, the author says, hey, here's what happened. They multiplied. They filled the earth. They became numerous. They became abundant. All the exact same language from Genesis chapter 1 about God's blessing of creation is being stated that it's going forward right here in Exodus chapter 1. You see, the mission of God couldn't be perceived by most people, but the author is saying, oh no, it's going forward in this explosion of the population. It's tremendous repetition of language that demonstrates that God is moving his program forward. In fact, there's one little neat thing here. It says that they were very, very numerous. Now, your Bible doesn't use that language because it's really bad English, right? We don't like it if a student tells us, well, it was very, very important. Well, in Hebrew, they did it every once in a while. And so the language in Hebrew is it was ma'od b'ma'od. It was very, very exceedingly multiplying. That doesn't happen very often. But in Genesis 17, when God says to Abraham, I'm going to confirm my covenant with you, you will be very, very increasing. You will be very, very multiplying. That's very unusual language. Guess where it appears again? Right here. Exodus chapter 1, verse 7. You will be very, very multiplying. The author is using language to help the reader of the Old Testament go, wow, what God started in chapter 1, what he continued with the life of Abraham, what he sent through the life of Isaac and Jacob, which seemed to be stalled for 400 years in Egypt. It's actually going forward. It's marching onward. No one could see it. 400 years without prophets speaking, 400 years without a temple or tabernacle, 400 years where all these descendants of Jacob were tucked away in a little corner of Egypt. And the world probably went, I guess the mission of God just got forgotten. And the author writes, and he says, no. When it looks invisible, the mission of God is marching forward. That's good news for us entering 2025. It may appear to us that the mission of God in forming a people for himself is making no visible progress. You know that the mission of God started in Genesis chapter 1 and handed off through Israel has a new shape, but it still has the same motivation and the same end goal that God is forming a people for himself. that God is calling people out of the world who will declare his praises and who be the representation of God himself upon the earth. That's what the mission of God is for us today. And so often it looks like, well, you can't even see it. It just seems kind of invisible. CNN doesn't report on the mission of God. Fox News doesn't give us any update on here's how the mission of God did today. And if you're not careful, we can be distracted into thinking about so many other things than the mission of God. I mean, life gets full about our attention being diverted to completing school, becoming a good husband or wife, or paying the bills, or pleasing the employer, or pursuing our hobbies, or getting some rest, or preparing for retirement. And next thing you know, we've hardly thought about the mission of God. And what Moses tells us in this book is you are part of something much bigger. The world won't report on it, and you may not immediately see it. But just like in Egypt, under a cloud of darkness, in 2025, the mission of God is marching onward. And we are part of it. By faith, we see. It's good news, right? Good news for 2025. If everything else falls apart, the mission of God is going forward. There's some bad news that comes with the good news. And the bad news is this: when the mission of God does become visible, it is opposed by the world. When it's invisible, it's really going forward. When it becomes visible, when it becomes noticeable, when it becomes more prominent in our world, it becomes opposed by the world and the forces of evil. Our text this morning will show us how indeed the mission of God, when it became visible to Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt, that he raised great opposition to it. In fact, there are three types of opposition that are explained in this text. There's the opposition of forced slave labor that we'll look at. There's an opposition of a brutal, barbaric birth control. There's an opposition that's going to come through infanticide. This Pharaoh will do almost nothing. He'll do almost anything to stop the spread of the mission of God. But before we look at what he does, let's look at how he assesses this growth of the Israelites, because his evaluation is just off. We're in chapter 1 once again, and I want you to see verses 8 through 10, where the king, this new king who didn't know Joseph, saw the multiplication of Israelites, and he assessed it as a national threat. This is a problem, all these people. And so he'll have to do something about it. Chapter 1 and verse 8. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, literally, he didn't know about Joseph, he didn't know about relationship, he didn't know about famine issues from 400 years ago. A new king came to power in Egypt, and he said, look, verse 9, look to his people, the Israelites, that they have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies and fight against us, and they're going to leave the country. He assessed this population growth as a national threat. This new king saw the growing number of the Israelites, and he recognized that this could potentially be a problem that would be bad for Egypt instead of good. You know, these people, these Israelites, they could join our enemies. And if they join our enemies, then there'll be a pretty strong force, and they're going to fight against us. And so the Pharaoh thinks, because if they fight against us and we can't control it, then we're going to lose them. And we lose the benefit of having these Israelites, probably even slaves at that point, in our midst. It's a political tactic that's been used by many governments over the years. It's a concern over an ethnic group or a minority group that says, these people really present a threat to us. Then they can seek to eliminate them. The Nazis made these kinds of claims against the Jews. The pro-Palestinian groups today are contending that Israel is a threat to their existence. It's very interesting to listen to the rhetoric of the campaign that we just finished here in the U.S. The Republicans and the Democrats each called the other a threat to democracy. Why? Because if you can stir up enough fear, then you can commit all kinds of atrocities to control and eliminate another group. So that's what the Pharaoh's doing. He's saying, look, this is really bad, all this growth. We got to do something about it. And the repercussions of his decision, they start in chapter 1, but they will ripple through the next 13 chapters of the book. So what did he do about it? As this mission of God became visible in Egypt, the Pharaoh decided to crush it. And he was going to make sure that it did not go forward. So his first line of oppression was in verses 11 through 14 with enforced slave labor. Chapter 1, verse 11. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And they built Pithom and Ramesses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. This is not a good situation. This is going from perhaps a kind of slavery that was amenable and worked well, and maybe they were even paid for their labor, probably progressing through the courses of a few years to the point where now they are not fed, they're abused, they're victims of state control. And the hope is that not only their spirits will be crushed, but their population will reduce. Forced slave labor. That was strategy 1. When it didn't get the kind of results that the Pharaoh wanted, what he did was he oppressed the mission of God and the people of God even more. Now with a form of barbaric birth control. It's described in verses 15 and 16. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, when you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that the baby is a boy, kill him! But if it's a girl, let her live. Folks, we can hardly imagine this. This is late-term abortion at its worst. This is a ruler who is now so fearful and so ruthless that he'll put out a decree to look for male Hebrew babies to make sure they don't live. Oppression against the very mission of God. Pharaoh didn't get the results he wanted. So he finally decided a third level of resistance. And in verse 22, we find that Pharaoh is going to say to his own people, go look for Hebrew male babies and throw them in the Nile. Chapter 1, verse 22 ends with this statement. And then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people. Every Hebrew boy that is born, you must literally send out into the Nile, and let every girl live. What kind of a man would go from slave labor to this barbaric form of birth control, ultimately to infanticide, bent on stopping the mission of God and the multiplication of Israelites in his land? Wow. Why did Moses write this for the original readers? What is Israel about to go into the promised land? What do they learn from this? I think they can see it. When the mission of God becomes visible, when it becomes clear to our world that God is doing something for his people, it will be opposed. And Israel is going to march into the promised land, and they're going to be confronted with the reality of walled cities. They're going to run into Canaanites who resist them and their advances. They will meet Philistines with swords and spears who seek to kill them. They will be confronted by Amalekites who will attack them and kill them and rape their women and pillage their villages. See, this is what happens when the people of God, when the mission of God is advancing. The world opposes. Later generations of Israelites will experience this all the more. The Assyrians will come centuries later and attack the northern tribes of Israel. Later, it'll be the Babylonians who will come and oppose the very people of God. And a few hundred years before Jesus comes, there will be Antiochus IV Epiphanes, a man who will come and desecrate the temple and overrun Jerusalem. Because there are forces in our world that always oppose the mission of God. And so Israel must learn that and be assured that the mission of God was not getting crushed. It's actually alive and well through that. May I suggest to you that in 2025, as God makes around the world his mission visible, as there is progress with the gospel, as people come to Christ, as churches do grow, as missionary movements encounter new lands and new peoples, as the scripture is translated and people begin to learn it, it will be met with opposition. It will be met with resistance. Of course, we know this. Jesus said, if they hated me, they will hate you. He said, in this world you will have trouble. And I don't think he's talking about paying the bills or getting something good to eat. Christians now around the world, maybe even more intensely in our own country, are seen as a threat. A threat to democracy, a threat to women's choice, women's rights, a threat to liberal ideology. In some quarters, Christians are considered a threat to freedom of speech. It doesn't take long to search the newscasts and realize that in recent days, Christians in our countries have been called far-right activists and fascists and radicals and even terrorists guilty of hate speech. And the stage is set for a fear-induced opposition that could be more intense than anything we've ever known in our lives. And the mission of God goes forward, alive and well and in opposition. So what do we expect in 2025? Good news, when it's invisible, the mission of God's going forward. Hard, bad news, when it becomes visible, the mission of God will be opposed. But now the better news. And the better news is this. Through opposition by the world, God advances his mission and prepares a deliverer. Through the opposition of the world, God, in the most amazing way, advances his mission and prepares a deliverer, provides a deliverer for his people. It was true in Egypt. Through the opposition of Pharaoh, God amazingly advanced his mission and provided a deliverer. we're going to see that no matter how high the barrier, no matter how great the obstacle, no matter how strong the governmental degree, no fear tactics were going to stop God from advancing his mission. Look with me about several instances how this takes place in this text. We're going to go back to verses 9 and 10 and see how God advanced his mission through Pharaoh's opposition. Verse 9, Pharaoh's words, I love this. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Literally, the text reads like this. The Israelites, these sons of Israel, they're a people. They're a people. Now, we don't translate it because it doesn't make great English. But he's seeing something. What was a group of kind of ragtag descendants 400 years ago, just a bunch of clans, they become a nation. But then that's what God was doing, was forming a people. That's what he said he would do. They've become far too numerous for us. They're going to become even more numerous. Yeah, it's funny. These are the words from whose mouth? Pharaoh. But he's using the words from Genesis. Now, I don't think he really understood the covenant. I don't think he understood the promise. I don't think he ever conceived of this as the mission of God. But the author writes in such a way that when Pharaoh is speaking, he doesn't recognize that he's actually acknowledging that the mission of God is going forward. It keeps advancing despite opposition. It continues with this statement that Israel, he's concerned about, will leave the country. Do you see it there in verse 10? They're going to literally go up from the land. They're going to go up. Now, you and I might say, well, yeah, of course, that's a bit of a threat. Very important word, because 10 more times in the book of Exodus, 10 more, when Israel is leaving the country, guess what word is used? They went up. They went up from Egypt. They went up from the land. They went up. They went up. And Pharaoh, he knows that they're going to go up, same word, from the land. He sees something that for the reader means that the mission of God is advancing. It's going forward. There's a couple of other demonstrations of God advancing his mission. Verse 12 is perhaps my favorite. So simple, straightforward. It says, but the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. Pharaoh kept trying to crush them. And what happened? They kept multiplying more. It didn't work. It was counterproductive. Everything he wanted to do was put his thumb in the dam, but when he did, the water spilled out and overflowed. He poured water on the fire, but the fire spread. He couldn't do anything to stop this multiplication of Israelites, this advancement of the mission of God. Of course, he's going to hire the midwives, but the midwives are going to fear God more than Pharaoh. And they allow the babies, the Hebrew male babies, to live. I can only imagine the report when Pharaoh gets word from perhaps his officers or his military outpost. He says, they keep increasing. So he calls the midwives back in and says, what is this you've done? And he's expecting a report that would say, yeah, we keep killing them, but they keep... No. They say, well, we can't get to those women fast enough. They just give birth. God is advancing his program. God is moving forward with his mission despite the opposition. And then the most fascinating element of all will be the birth of a very special child. God will advance his kingdom, advance his mission, in bringing the deliverer through all of this opposition. I'm sure you know the story well, but chapter 2, we'll look at the first 10 verses for a moment. A man of the tribe of Levi, married to a Levite, that begins to send signals. This is going to be someone who's from the priestly tribe, someone who helps people get connected to God. And she became pregnant and gave birth to a son, and when she saw the son was a fine child. She hid him for 3 months. The idea here is not that, man, that's one good-looking baby. I mean, every mama thinks that about their baby, right? It's the word tov, good. She sees that this is a special child, one who's been blessed by God. It's the word used in Genesis chapter 1 when God over and over says he saw what he did on the first day and it was good, and on the second day it was good. It was the statement of blessing. It's the way it's supposed to be. It's the way it's supposed to be. It's done. It's complete. It's the statement of what God did for the midwives earlier in the chapter. It says that he did good for them so that they could have life and families. And now she sees in this child that God has made him good, blessed him, set him apart as special. God's mission is advancing. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus. Now your text says basket. It's ark. She made a little ark. Guess where that word is used? Only one other place. Noah's ark. That would be used to deliver Noah from the waters. Now another ark is prepared for Moses, and this little baby is put in it and preserved by his mother. She placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile, and his sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. And Pharaoh's daughter went down the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket, the ark, among the reeds and sent her female slave to get it. And she opened it, and a baby, and he's crying. And she felt sorry for him. Now, wait a minute. This is Pharaoh's daughter. She's supposed to help execute male babies. What is she doing? She's completely out of line. And she has compassion on this little baby boy who's from an Israelite, Levite family. And of course, she'll hire the mother to be a nurse and care for him for the early years of his life. And then verse 10, when the child grew older, she, that's her mother, his mother, took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him, finally we see, Moses. Because I drew him out of water. Fascinating thing here, because she's saying a word that isn't quite right for Hebrew. I drew him out of water. But literally what it means is he will draw out of water. That's what Moses is. It's the active voice. I will draw out of water. Because this one that she drew out of water, the reader knows, will be the one who will draw them out of Egypt through the water. God is taking the lowest class of society, midwives, a Hebrew mama, an Egyptian daughter, and using them as instruments to preserve the life of the man who will be the greatest deliverer for Israel. Amazing. Amazing. You see, no matter how great the opposition, there is this great deliverance. So we put this all together and we'd say, wow, certainly we understand that the greater the opposition to the mission of God, the more amazing the deliverance of God. The greater the opposition, the more amazing the deliverance. And so we look to 2025, and we do so with great anticipation. Anticipation that says, if the mission of God isn't visible today, we know it's moving forward. We anticipate that as the mission of God becomes more well-known and more visible and more prominent, and people see what God is doing, that it's going to be opposed, but it's alive and well. And we anticipate that as we face 2025, it is through the opposition that God brings an amazing advancement to his mission, the formation of his people. And he's preparing a deliverer who one day will rescue his people completely. I anticipate a great year in 2025. I don't know if the stock market's going to go up or down. I don't know if it's a good year to buy a house. I certainly don't know what's going to happen in the Middle East. But this I know. We're the people of God. And he's advancing his mission with us. Believe it. And so, our Father, forgive us when we so often are distracted by lesser important things in our lives. We are consumed so often with matters of life that at the moment are urgent, command our attention. And yet our desire as we sit here as your people this morning is to say, we want to focus on the great things you are doing. So I pray for myself and my friends that tomorrow morning when our alarms go off and our feet swing out of bed and hit the floor, that our first thought will be, oh, we're part of the mission of God, and it's going forward. Startle us with your attention to you and your work. May it consume our identity. May it captivate our thoughts. May it pull at our hearts with great longing for the day when we see the mission of God fully completed